This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This week, we continue our series on the Psalms. This is our sixth video. I'll just remind you once again, it's not on Psalm 6, it's the sixth video on the book of Psalms. And we're going to be looking at what I believe are the hardest Psalms for us. That is Psalms of imprecation, or sometimes called imprecatory Psalms. And to imprecate is to wish harm on another, or more usually calling upon a divine curse. Sometimes they're a little bit more less aggressive, and instead they're simply calling upon divine judgment, which at least has, I think, the sense of, well, God will decide what's going to happen, whereas this is a curse, is God's not deciding, I'm just cursing someone, or I'm just wishing harm. These could be very difficult to live into and to use in any meaning-filled way. In fact, some of them, such as Psalm 137, which at the very end of it has within it, and blessed are those who dash their babies against the ground. I mean, usually would be called a war crime. Sometimes the way we've solved it is just don't include that verse when we read it. But what do we do with these Psalms? How could they be helpful? How could we understand them? Well, that's what we want to try to address in this video. First is that imprecatory Psalms are in a category of Psalms of lament. Sometimes they're just called Psalms of lament, and there's not another category for them. I actually think that's a little bit too easy. Is just say, well, people are struggling, so they say mean things. No, there's something else going on. That is, yes, they're from lament, but it's focused. That is, it's focused almost always on our enemies. And it starts a little bit by stating, we really do have enemies. These are real things. And these are real people, which is why some interpreters, for example, like to think of these Psalms as essentially allegorical, that nobody really is calling upon God to harm another. I'm not so convinced you can get away with a non-allegorical or with an allegorical reading, because it's based on the idea that we really do have enemies, and that the lament I have is more than just I'm suffering. It's also I want God to do something about it. The earlier video we had on Psalms of Lament, most of that will apply here, but I think sometimes we get the sense that that's very individual and it's about me and God. Here it is about me and God, but it's also about the circumstance I'm living in compared to the promise God has provided. If you look back at our, I think, second video on the Psalms, you'll remember that's where lament really lives. God promised one thing, my reality is not the same. Well, obviously I want God to do something about it. And so judgment is part of that. I want God to deal with these enemies that are very real. And so therefore, I personally do not think the best way to read these is allegorical, except for the sense of, well, all meaning is figurative at some level, but as if to say it's not really about what it's about. No, I think it really is about that. And instead of taking that exit ramp, let's live in that and see what's going on here. Well, first is that the overarching message of these Psalms is a concept of divine justice. The word justice and the word righteousness in both Hebrew and Greek as one word. Tzedakah or dikaios. That is an English distinction to say that there's justice secularly or something and righteousness spiritually. It's all one thing. And the idea is that this also is real. Just as our enemies are real things we have to face, also God really does have justice and righteousness. There is a rightness the world is supposed to live in. And that tension is what really drives Psalms of imprecation. Well, if there's divine justice, and I have enemies that are opposed to the promises of God, then logically, if God is going to deliver, very important word, deliver me and us, usually it's communal, not individual, deliver us from our enemies, it does look like our enemies being destroyed. Of course, Israel was a political entity, and so we're speaking often politically. But part of this we should recognize is that justice and righteousness is built on the mercy and blessing of God. There is not a sense in Hebrew Bible or anywhere else in the Bible that I have merited God's deliverance compared to others. In fact, there is a very real contradiction in Psalms of imprecation. As if to say, the mercy and blessing is for me, whereas hard, cold justice is for them. And one thing you're going to find is that sometimes they say, well, then the logical end of that is a problem. It doesn't go to the logical end. That's an important element of Psalms of imprecation, but actually all Psalms. It does not take you to the logical end. It is a journey where we express a number of theologically rich ideas through this journey, and part of it is to get us to express. So therefore, there's a few things on this journey in a Psalm of imprecation. First is simply alarm. That is call to attention the problem really facing us, because we're only need to be delivered from our enemies by God if we truly cannot ourselves. Second is a space of catharsis. This is maybe the most obvious and easiest way to handle Psalms of imprecation. I really need to get this out of my system, and I'm going to take this out of my system to God, and I'm going to get that move forward. Some would say, well, that's the goal, so you won't actually do these things. However, we should recognize most of the Psalms of imprecation are not asking us to do things, but instead for God to do things. So I think it's more, there is some hope God's really going to do these things, but the point is our catharsis, because after all, the Psalms, just like all biblical theology, absolutely believe in the providence of God, meaning God is going to do whatever God wants to do, whether or not we express it because of the providence of God, but it is good for us to express it. That's what all praise and prayer is. This is who I am. This is who God is. This is where I am. And this is where I think God is going to be. And so a lot of that's going on. And then the second component we should recognize is that this is an integrity piece. If you'll recall, several of our videos have pointed out that the Psalms capture our whole person. Who are we before God? What is my whole soul and spirit? We talked about that. Neither of those mean what we mean in English by that. My whole being, who is that before God? Well, part of who that is before God is that one that has enemies and wants God to do things about those enemies. It's not necessarily the nicest thing in the world, and it recognizes it is a contradiction where it's deliverance for me, justice for them, but that's what I'm believing and holding and feeling in this movement. And so we see this in several Psalms, Psalms like 35, 69, 109, 137, these Psalms of imprecation. And we should also point out it's not only the Psalms that have moments of imprecation. A lot of the prophets do as well. They're speaking to communities with enemies. But the point of it is my whole person is before God. And my whole person is trying to express this. And do I recognize that God can do whatever God wants? Yes. There is room absolutely for surprise. That I was sure God's justice meant curse for them, blessing for me. But it turns out God was up to something I couldn't imagine. And that's okay in Psalms of imprecation. But what we're hoping for is that God is going to resolve the internal tension in all lament, God's promise versus my experience. And so the way that's going to happen is absolutely a space of surprise. And it turns out that mercy and blessing very well might apply very differently than I expected. And if you look ex post facto, after the fact, it's, maybe this was about justice and righteousness, but not necessarily for them, but for me. Often a reflection, like you see in the Deuteronomistic history. But these Psalms can be hard. Yet, there is a place here about this is about God's justice and my ability to express God's justice in this world. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.